But first, I want to tell you about on the shores of Phillip Island in Victoria, Australia, there are burrows of thousands upon thousands of fairy penguins. And they're just really cute little birds. They stand just under 12 inches tall. And every morning, okay, they're both coming up. Every morning, the adult penguins head out to sea to catch fish. And then at the end of the day, they return to land to bring their food to their chicks. But the guy who wrote this, Scott Higgins, and this is true, said that it's both funny and exhilarating to watch them make that journey from the water to their burrows. He said they kind of surf in on the waves, and then they all gather at the water's edge. And then they create groups, and when they feel safe, then the groups will start heading out towards the burrows, which is about 1/10 of a mile from where they are. And what happens is that some of the groups make it, but all of a sudden a group will just turn around and they'll just waddle their way back to the water. And this will go on all day into the evening until finally they have all made it safe to their burrows. And so what's going on with that? Why is there this start and stop ritual? Well, at sea, the birds are safe because they can swim well, they can dive deep, and so they're safe from predators such as eagles and hawks and dogs and cats. But and they're safe in their burrows down below. But on the land, they're not safe because they go so slow. So when the groups start to go out, if they see even a shadow of something, bam, they turn around and they go back to the safety of the water. So he goes on to say, it seems like a lot of humans are like the fairy penguins, that when confronted with challenging situations we find ourselves in, like the penguins, we stand at the water's edge. And we know where we've got to go. We know we've got to get across that beach to get back to the burrow, but it can be so incredibly terrifying. And then when we step out of that water and we start waddling towards safety, we're in no man's land, it's dangerous and uncertain, that's where we're vulnerable. And yet to get to that place, we have to allow ourselves to get beyond that safety zone and to strike out into that world of vulnerability. So I want to remind us that for these weeks we are looking at practical application of things in our lives. That Unity has always been known as practical Christianity, and so we're bringing some practical ideas into the service in order that we can truly live that amazing life that God is for us. And so we are looking at the book Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. She has a PhD. She has researched this topic for over a decade, and her material is just so amazing. So our mission is to encourage and inspire spiritual and personal growth by empowering each other to be authentically all that we came here to be. And I love that that's our mission, because I believe that out of that authenticity comes service, comes love, comes compassion, comes oneness, comes all the things that we would attribute to God. And so we are going to be the presence of love. We are going to be the presence of generosity. We are going to be the presence of kindness and oneness. And that to be authentic is going to take some work. I would say really for all of us, I think I'd be safe in saying that, because we all have our things that we still kind of hide. Brene says that authenticity is a collection of choices that we have to make every day. It's about the choice to show up and be real. The choice is to be honest. The choice is to let our true selves be seen. And that's the daring greatly part. The big daring greatly is to let ourselves be seen. And to know that's our authentic, real self. She also says that daring greatly, this is just some review, is the courage to be vulnerable, to show up and be seen, to ask for what you need, to talk about how you're feeling, and to have the hard conversations. And of course, last week we said those are so easy for us to do. Remember that? No. Okay, so in her book, she talks about some vulnerability myths. And the first one that I want to start with is that vulnerability is a weakness. That is a myth. And I think because our culture doesn't really support us being vulnerable, doesn't really support us, sharing our feelings or crying or being real about things. Our culture in itself doesn't support this. She said vulnerability is not weakness, and the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure we face every day are not optional. Our only choice is a question of engagement. Our willingness to own and engage with our vulnerability determines the depth of our courage. And the reality, my friends, is we have opportunities every day. Just to be alive, we're vulnerable. To be alive is vulnerability. And we have opportunities so many times during the day where we can engage in something or we can choose to step back and not let ourselves be seen. And this is what this material is about for me anyway, is how we can finally really engage in life, engage with other people in other situations, and be authentic in that. How many of you have been in situations where you felt so differently from what was happening or what was being expressed, but you didn't voice it? Anybody? How did that feel? It doesn't feel good. It's a conflict inside of us. And I know in my own life, because this has been my journey, has been the journey of authenticity. And when I was really struggling, it showed up as passive aggressive, because I would not say something and then it would stew inside of me. And then at some point, some little things or some little arrows are coming out that are sarcastic. And it feels so much better to be in a space where I live my authenticity so much better than I used to live it in the past. Now, 2 Timothy tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Ambrose Redmond says, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. I love that, because I've heard courage is the absence of fear. No, it's not. Because if you're in the place of courage, it's because you've been afraid. But it means that something else is more important than that fear. And you're willing, as she says, to get into the arena. And some quotes, our good old John Wayne, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. And Dan Rather said, courage is being afraid, but going on anyhow. And this is E.E. Cummings says, it takes courage to grow up and become who you really are. That's powerful right there. And Brene Brown says, vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. Wow, this is such a different paradigm for us. Again, because our culture has not supported that. Now, Brene defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's a big deal, emotional exposure. And she says that the perception that vulnerability is a weakness is actually a dangerous thing for us. Because if I think vulnerability is a weakness, showing, crying, expressing what I think or what my needs are, if I think that's a weakness, then I'm going to much more easily judge others who are actually being vulnerable. And what does that create? That creates separation right then and there. So in her research, she asked her participants to write vulnerability is, and then, what is vulnerability? So here's some things that I think will relate to them. Sharing an unpopular opinion, standing up for myself, asking for help, saying no, starting my own business, helping my 37-year-old wife with stage 4 breast cancer make decisions about her will, hearing how my son wants to make first chair in the orchestra and encouraging him while knowing that it's probably not going to happen, the first date after my divorce, getting promoted and not knowing if I'm going to succeed, falling in love, waiting for the biopsy to come back, exercising in public, especially when I don't know what I'm doing and I'm out of shape, admitting I'm afraid, standing up for myself and friends when someone else is critical or gossiping, asking for forgiveness, going to my first AA meeting. How many of us can relate to all those things? And so the question here, do any of those sound like weaknesses? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And yet those are all aspects of what vulnerability is. And Brene says that vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage, and that truth and courage, they aren't always comfortable for us to move into. I was trying to think of a different word there, but that's what it is. They aren't always comfortable for us to move into. So the next thing she asked was, how does vulnerability feel? It feels like taking off the mask and hoping the real me isn't too disappointed. It feels like not sucking it in anymore. It's where courage and fear meet. You are halfway across a tightrope, and moving forward and going back are both just as scary. Sweating palms and a racing heart. Scary and exciting, terrifying and hopeful. Going out on a limb, a very, very high limb. Taking the first step toward what you fear most. A lump in my throat and a knot in my chest. The terrifying point on a roller coaster when you're about to tip over the edge and take the plunge. Freedom and liberation. It feels like fear every single time. Panic, anxiety, fear, and hysteria, followed by freedom, pride, and amazement, then a little more panic. It's like free falling. It's like letting go of control. So this list is why we don't do vulnerable, because it's very uncomfortable for us to do that. We would rather actually be on the roller coaster that's up there and going to go down than be emotionally in that place. And yet, it is such an important part of our journey. I love Bishop John Shelby Spong talks about how we focus so much on our spirituality, but that truly living our most amazing life is bringing our humanity into our spirituality and recognizing that we are here in these bodies. This is an incredible gift, and we are human beings, and we do have some limitations in our lives. We do, and that's okay. But to bring our spirituality more into our humanity, we have to recognize that in our humanity, that there's a lot of stuff that has gone on in our lives that have helped to create these facades, these masks that we wear, and that it's going to take some work to start taking those masks off and to be real and authentic. And yet it's just the best thing. The biggest comment that she got was, it feels like I'm naked. How many of you have had dreams where you're in a grocery store or you're doing something and all of a sudden you realize you're naked? Yeah. Pretty scary, isn't it? I'm always so grateful when I wake up and go, whew, thank you, God, that it wasn't. During her TED Talk, she asked how many people think that vulnerability is a weekend, and she said hands went up all over. And then she asked, when you watched people on the stage being vulnerable, how many of you thought that that was courageous? And hands went up across the stage. And she said, it's easy for us to see and witness and embrace somebody else's vulnerability, but we don't want to do it. And yet it's incredible courage. It's not a weakness. And that's the one thing I want us to get today, that vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, I think in any relationship that we're in, whether it's a romantic partnership, a friendship, a family relationship, business partnership, neighbors, whatever it is, I think that if we cannot be vulnerable and be truly authentic in our expression, then we're missing part of that connection. And it's so important. And it doesn't mean with every person, know that. I know that in families, sometimes there's somebody you're just not going to have a relationship with. That's okay. But I'm talking about the relationships that are really, really important to us, that taking this journey into vulnerability and taking off these masks, it will make the relationship so much deeper when we do that. So vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage. Myth number 2 is I don't do vulnerability. I was listening to a minister and he said that, that this other minister said, hey, we're going to read this book and do a series on this book. And he, reads the first part of it, and he went into her office and he said, I don't do vulnerability. And she laughed and she sent him to this chapter and myth number 2. And again, to be alive is to be vulnerable. And it's hard for both men and women. For women, to be vulnerable, well, part of it is then, again, in our culture, we haven't encouraged men to be vulnerable, and we haven't really given tools for that. And so when a woman becomes vulnerable and becomes emotional, it's really hard for a lot of men to be able to be present to that. And so we risk that. But also in our culture, we've gone now into this strong, independent woman thing, which is great. And at the same time, don't let it be a facade. Let yourself still be real. You can be strong and independent, and we still need each other. And again, for men, it is this thing that vulnerability has been looked upon. How many times growing up did you hear your dad or somebody else say, boys don't cry, boys don't cry. And bam, right there, it's a shameful thing if I show my emotions. And I'm sure most of us weren't encouraged when we were young to express what we were really feeling. In fact, most of the time, if we expressed what we were really feeling, it was the parent saying, I said so this is why you're doing it. And so we weren't encouraged in that. The reality is we all do vulnerability. We do. And the question is, am I willing to engage in that? The third myth is that vulnerability is about letting it all hang out. And I love where she goes with this, because vulnerability is not about just, coming into a group dynamic or seeing somebody in the grocery store and saying, hi, my name is Sue, and blah, 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 blah. It's not about that. To be in that space of vulnerability, you choose people that you can trust and that are just going to be there to hold that space for you. They're going to help you, and they're going to listen. They're going to listen with an open heart. I love the definition that to listen is I'm willing to be changed by what I hear. And I know, for Paul and I, just in these 6 months and in relationship, there have been times when I'm like, I really need to communicate this. And I'll get very clear, yes, I need to communicate this. But man, my little heart is just beating. But I'm so grateful because he meets whatever I say with such unconditional love. And it doesn't mean he always agrees with what I say, but I have the space. And I think that really deepens our relationship when we can express what our needs are. We can express what we're feeling, what our fears are. But we do it in the safety of certain people. And then that, of course, takes it to myth number 4, and that's that I can do it alone, and no, you can't. No, you can't. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. So when I look at the numerous healings, Jesus raised some people from the dead, and imagine being the person or the family member that is now going to go to this great teacher, this revered teacher where hundreds of people or thousands of people are gathered around him, and imagine that risk and that vulnerability as they're going to him and they're asking him, can you heal me? Can you heal my son? Raise this person from the dead. You talk about vulnerability and stepping into that place where you could be ridiculed, you could be told, no, absolutely not. But their desire was so big that they were willing to risk all of that to get the healing. And I love what Brene says. She said, the question isn't, what would I do if I were brave? The question is, what would I do if I knew I could not fail? It is, what would I do even if I fail? Wow. Big difference in that question. What would I do even if I fail? What are we willing to risk in order to receive our healing? What are we willing to risk in order to really live the principles that we talk about on a weekly basis? What are we willing to risk to have deeper connections and deeper relationships with the people that we love? What are we willing to risk? And is it more important than what it is that we're afraid of? And I'm going to say, if not in every situation, in almost every situation, it is worth it. It is worth it. And it is time for us to love and support each other in this, because we can't support the world around us if we can't support it for each other. And it is scary. You know, when you're asking for a need, or you're telling somebody what's really going on in your heart and your mind, or you're stepping out into a new adventure, you know, that and maybe when you're stepping out into that new adventure, you are so afraid, but you don't want to tell anybody. But yet, when you can go to a trusted person and just say, I am scared to death. Oh my gosh. Boom. It's amazing how once you get it out, it really releases that energy. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I feel better now that I've been able to share that. So your homework this week, if you choose to do it, is to look at your relationships and maybe pick the one that's the most important to you at this point in your life. And think about, is there anything that I am not expressing that's the real me? Am I hiding in some way because I'm afraid? I'm afraid they're not going to accept me, they're going to judge me, you know, they're going to leave me. But allow yourself to move into that place of, hey, this is who I am. And because the best thing we can do in our lives is to be authentic, is to be authentically who we came here to be. So we're going to close with an affirmation. And if we'll join together, I am enough. I bravely open myself to life and love. Do you guys mean that? Because it was like, I am enough. I bravely open myself to life and love. I am enough. I am enough. I am enough. I am enough. Yeah, I am enough. And I bravely open myself to life and love. And we're going to let it all hang out. Namaste. Namaste.